This recording connects with the extension and expansion of absolute monarchy in Europe, starting in France, of course, and then the phenomenon and establishment of absolute monarchy to the east in Prussia and Russia. This video connects with your handouts, page 13 and 14, and some additional study guidelines that are on your dashboard page. Additionally, this video connects with information that you read in pages 509 to 515 in your textbook. So you have a few resources to draw from for the study guidelines on dashboard. So pull page 13 and we'll start there. Remember that absolute monarchy began in France under Louis XIV, but it was a model that other monarchs copied throughout Europe and became the standard governmental system by the end of the 17th century and into the 18th century. And the Hohenzollern family of Prussia followed this model. And here you can see the territorial holdings of the Hohenzollerns here in orange. And you can see that the Hohenzollerns held disunited territories and kingdoms, some fairly large territories, but not contiguously linked. Now, the importance of the Hohenzollern family you can see on the top of page 13. Eventually, this is going to be the family that unifies German lands and creates the country of Germany. There was a notion of the German people before the unification of Germany, but as it says there on your page, Germany was not a country until 1871. This will be the family that ultimately unifies these lands and creates the country of Germany as their kingdom, the Hohenzollern family. It said on your page there that other states have had armies. Prussia was an army which had a state. The goal, just like Louis XIV and just like Richelieu in France, the goal of Prussia in terms of creating an absolute monarchy and vesting sovereignty in a sole ruler, monarch, like Frederick William Hohenzollern of Prussia, was to empower Prussia. The goal was power. And Frederick William, the great elector of Prussia, the king of Prussia, he understood what it meant to be a decentralized power. I mean, here's his territorial holdings here. And look at the dates in which he reigned. He reigned his reign began at the end of the 30 Years' War, where there were multiple, more centralized foreign powers coming in and fighting for territory and influence and religious considerations on German soil in the Holy Roman Empire here. This Germany, of course, suffered ruination at the hands of multiple foreign powers fighting in the territory of the German lands. So Frederick William, his goal is to centralize power and authority in order for Prussia to become more powerful, specifically, very specifically, in order to build up a more powerful military. That was the bottom line. All right, so Prussia and Brandenburg, the holdings of the Hohenzollern family, were some of very, very many. Remember, the Holy Roman Empire is incredibly decentralized, hundreds of little pockets of control. The Hohenzollerns were fairly major power holders here, but again, they hold a disunited territories. Now, the lords in Prussia and Brandenburg were very powerful. The lords in Prussia and Brandenburg went by the name of Junkers. That was the name of Prussian lords. So just like in France, the monarchy strikes a deal with the lords. The goal is more power. They strike a deal with the lords where the lords give over sovereignty to the Hohenzollern monarch. But in exchange, and remember, the lords in the East are more powerful. You had less freedom. You had serfdom still existed in the East. The lords were just generally more powerful in Eastern Europe. So the Junkers had more leverage than the lords in France. So the Junkers give over their sovereignty to the Hohenzollern family in exchange for basically complete control over the local peasantry, and they are going to intensify, under absolute monarchy in Prussia, they are going to intensify serfdom. Free labor duties and free labor services to the lord become greater under absolute monarchy in Prussia. The Junkers also receive a large amount of tax exemption, and they become the military officer class. The Prussian lords, on a hereditary basis, would be your military officers in the Prussian military. And as it says on your page there, this centralization of power in the hands of the Hohenzollern monarch and the agreement that's struck at the expense of the people, just like in France, an agreement of the upper class is struck at the expense of the people. But in this case, it's the intensification of serfdom. Remember, in the case of France, it was a heavy tax burden. In this case, in Prussia, it's the intensification of serfdom, and it's all geared towards building up greater military might for Prussia. And you can see on your page there, under Frederick William, the greater elector of Prussia, by the time his son, Frederick William I, reigned, and this is now into the 18th century, and you can see the dates that Frederick William reigned there. Prussia had the 12th largest population. It's not a huge territory, but it had the 4th largest and the most highly respected military on the continent. So again, the goal of centralization of authority, of sovereignty, is the development of power. And Prussia effectively built itself into a military power. Eventually, the Hohenzollerns are going to use this growing military power, and again, it won't be until the late 19th century, but to forcibly unify Germany and create Germany through a series of military successes. Okay, let's shift further east here to Russia. And the figure of absolute monarchy, the creator of absolute monarchy, is Peter Romanov. Now, you've got the Bourbon family is the ruling family in France. You've got the Habsburg family, of course, is the ruling family in Austria and the Habsburg Empire. You've got the Hohenzollerns in Prussia-Brandenburg and the Romanov family in Russia. The Romanov family in Russia became absolute monarchs under Peter the Great. And just like Louis XIV, just like Frederick William in Prussia, the goal of Peter the Great, Peter Romanov, is to consolidate power in his own hands in order to make Russia more powerful. His goal is to make Russia increasingly powerful. Now, one thing you need to know about Russia at this point in time, and you can see that Peter the Great is a member of, on your page there, you can see that Peter the Great is a member of the Romanov family. The Romanov family began ruling Russia as the monarchs in 1613. Peter the Great was the monarch of Russia in the late 17th and early 18th century. The goal of Peter the Great is to empower Russia. Russia, up until this point, had been largely separate from Western civilization. They're Eastern Orthodox Christians. They're a different form of Christianity. Even when Western civilization was unified under the Catholic Church religiously, Russia was separate from that. Russia was not in a tremendous amount of contact with Western civilization culturally. Russia, frankly, the monarchs and the lords of Europe didn't really know a whole lot about Russia, weren't in much direct contact with Russia. Peter the Great's goal is power for Russia, and he looks to Western civilization as a model. He's looking at the growing wealth and power of Western civilization. He wants to become an increasing power player internationally. So he looks to Western civilization as a model, and he literally travels. He wants to westernize Russia. And he's going to modernize Russia based on Western civilization. So he wants to emulate and copy Western civilization. So he travels west, and he takes a trip to England, to the Netherlands. He goes to France. He travels west, and he studies Western civilization. He goes to shipyards. A big emphasis for Peter the Great was gaining territory so that Russia could have a navy and extend its international power and influence. He goes to museums in Western civilization to learn. He goes and studies the governments of Western civilization, of various kingdoms and societies in Western civilization. He goes to hospitals. He goes to factories, areas of production in Western civilization. His goal is for Russia to catch up with the West and become powerful along Western lines. And his goal is to permanently link Russia to Western civilization. Now, Russia was a different culture, is an Eastern Orthodox culture. Some consider it to be from a different civilization. Some think that Russia is part of Orthodox civilization, part of Eastern Orthodox civilization. And there were a lot of forces back in Russia that were not happy about Peter the Great trying to change their culture and change Russia and model Russia on the West. So while Peter the Great is in Western Europe, he has to cut his trip short. There's a rebellion, a conservative rebellion of the old believers. These are more traditional Eastern Orthodox Christians, more traditional Orthodox members of Russian culture and society who don't want to modernize, don't want to westernize, don't want to change the traditional culture of Russia, don't agree with the goal of Peter the Great to establish absolute monarchy. Peter the Great, he goes back and he crushes this rebellion, this conservative rebellion that seeks to keep Russia traditional Russia. And he tortures and kills members of the rebellion with his own hands to send a message. Peter the Great is going to drag Russia towards westernization. He is bent on westernizing Russia in order for Russia to become more powerful. So he's going to torture and kill members of the rebellion with his own hands. And he's going to have hundreds of others brutally executed, hundreds of other old believers and other traditionalists that want to maintain traditional Russian society. And he's going to have these folks executed, and he's going to leave these bodies to rot as a sign of how bent and determined he is to change traditional Western culture. So as you read in pages 509 to 515, his goal is to alter Russia. He puts in place a beard tax. The old believers believed it was a sin to shave your beard. Eastern Orthodox Christianity is based on iconography of Jesus and Mary, is a big part of the religion. And here you can see the iconography of Jesus has a beard, so they believed that they should grow beards, and it was a symbol of a traditional way of life in Russia. Peter the Great puts a beard tax in place to get rid of these vestiges of traditional Eastern Orthodox society. He forces traditionalists to accept Western garb and clothing. He's going for a full cultural change in Russia. Now, the relationship between Peter the Great and his nobles, and the nobles were in Russia go by the name of boyars, and that's spelled Boyars, boyars, is that they were expected to serve in Peter the Great's government for life. So he sets up Western style schools. Again, he's trying to bring about this transformation in Russia. He sets up Western style schools. He brings a lot of specialists from Western civilization to serve in his government, to teach in the schools, to help build up the capability of the traditional upper class and turn them into government servants for his growing absolute monarchy. A big part of course, unsurprisingly, a big part of the agreement between the boyars and Peter the Great is that the boyars are going to be able to have complete control and over the serfs in Russia. Serfdom hadn't weakened barely at all in Russia, but in this agreement between the Romanov family, starting with Peter the Great, and the boyars, the Russian lords, they are going to have complete control over the serfs. And the serfs in Russia had it worse than any other serfs anywhere else. They were essentially slaves because the serfs in Russia, the boyars had so much control over the serfs in Russia that they could buy and sell serfs away from their families. Like, they weren't just tied to the land and had to give free labor to their lord. Their lord owned them through and through. They were property. They were like chattel slaves that could be bought and sold at the whim and the will of the lord. Peter the Great also owned controlled a tremendous amount of serfs as well. And Peter the Great used serfs in his armies. Russia had a small ruling upper class, very small ruling upper class, really no middle class to speak of, and then the bulk of the population is serfs. Probably 95% or more of the population is serfs. Basically no middle class to speak of, even into the 18th century, no middle class to speak of. It had been isolated largely from international trade. The lords and the monarch had been the dominant forces in Russia. So Peter the Great uses serfs, forces serfs to serve in his army. And in westernizing and intensifying serfdom in Russia, Peter the Great is able to have some breakthrough military victories for Russia. And one of these was its war against Sweden in the early 18th century. And the pivotal battle between Russia and Sweden is called the Battle of Poltava in 1709, where Russia defeats Sweden and exceeds Sweden in power for the first time. This is a big breakthrough for Russia because Peter the Great has now conscripted serfs, about 200,000 serfs, into his army, into a mass army that is forced to be loyal to him. And now Russia has gained territory, pivotal territory, that allows it access to the Baltic Sea. And you can see the Baltic Sea comes down here, and over here off the map is the Netherlands. Let me pull up a different map here. Here's the Baltic Sea, and here's the territory that Russia is able to gain by defeating Sweden. Here's the Baltic Sea, over here is the Netherlands, and over here off this map is England. So this gives Russia a connectedness to Western civilization. Once Russia is able to take this territory from Sweden and establish this territory as part of its own, now Russia has an entryway into and a direct connectedness to Western civilization, and Russia is now permanently linked to Western civilization, as Peter the Great wanted it. So Peter the Great, through the intensification of serfdom, and he's making the boyars his civil servants, his government officials. He's making the boyars his military officials. He's centralizing power in his hands and forcing Russia to westernize. Now what Russia has is a window on the West here. Now they are overseas. They are directly connected to Western civilization. And Peter the Great establishes a new capital, and here you can see it, St. Petersburg, named after his patron saint. So once they gain this territory, Peter the Great builds an entirely new capital. Here's the traditional capital, Moscow. Peter the Great builds an entirely new capital using serf labor, basically slave labor, and expends tens of thousands of lives. Serfs are worked to death, die in accidents. There's really no consideration for their safety or their lives. Peter the Great builds a new capital, which is called Russia's window on the west. Now through the Baltic Sea, and Russia starts to build up a navy here, through the Baltic Sea, Russia is connected with Western civilization. And Peter continues to westernize Russian culture and society. So St. Petersburg serves a few purposes. It's Russia's window on the west that permanently connects Russia with Western civilization. And Peter the Great has the expectation that the boyars, the Russian lords, are going to build estates here. This represents a big tax on the lords. They have to build like an entirely new house and palace estate in St. Petersburg. And they're expected to live part of the year there in order to serve the government. And St. Petersburg is the most western city in Russia. And the transformation becomes so great that the Russian court is going to be speaking French. Remember, France is the dominant cultural force and the most powerful country in Western civilization, or kingdom, I should say, in Western civilization during this time. So you've got this, by the end of Peter the Great's reign and into Catherine the Great, who's the next major absolute monarch in Russian history out of the Romanov family in the 18th century, you've got this small elite ruling class that's speaking French because they're so westernized. And they're ruling over the huge expanse of Russian territory, an enormous Russian inserfed population. So there's this huge divide between the upper class in Russia, basically no middle class to speak of, and the heavily inserfed population of that's living very difficult existence in the enormous expanse of Russian territory. St. Petersburg represents a Western-style capital, and a Western-oriented elite start to emerge under Peter the Great as he successfully builds absolute monarchy. It's said that Peter the Great had the most absolute of the absolute monarchies. He most intensively controlled all the other potential power holders, whether it be the masses, the serfs. It was said that Peter the Great controlled his lords more than any other society, the boyars, and he also controlled religious authority more than any of the other absolute monarchs. The Eastern Orthodox Church was very much under the control of the Romanov family. So Peter the Great is said to be the most absolute of all the absolute monarchs.